Okay, so now it's time to start on the grand journey, which is Understanding Nature by Ralph Waldo Emerson. This is a truly brilliant piece of work, very complex, sometimes a little bit frustrating, but something that really, if you put the time in, is going to be more rewarding than pretty much anything else. Emerson, for those of you who don't know, was one of the most famous intellectuals of the 19th century anywhere in the world. He was American, of course. He's most famous for this piece, Nature, Self-Reliance, The American Scholar, including a bunch of lesser-known works such as Circles. He's definitely somebody who has lived a very compelling life, is pretty much the founder of the school of thought known as transcendentalism, sort of the idea that you can achieve some sort of greater connection to the absolute via communion with nature, and that can give you the opportunity to transcend sort of the material world into a greater awareness. Influenced Thoreau, who actually spent time on his land at Walden Pond, and Whitman, for whom he sort of wrote a recommendation letter that Whitman then, published and promoted without Emerson's permission. Emerson, had a difficult life. He came from a long line of preachers. His father died when he was very young. He was married, and after he'd been married for under 2 years, his wife died of tuberculosis. That caused sort of a crisis of faith for him and caused him to sort of leave behind his congregation to sort of go on the life of being, sort of a public intellectual. But all of that is sort of, beside the point when considering this brilliant piece of work that we have before us, Nature, this sort of essay that we have. It's a grand document. It sort of is an example of Emerson's aphoristic style, the fact that he built a lot of his wisdom around, he's just basically he's a quote machine. He just constantly is churning out brilliant little pieces of wisdom. He'd be great working in a fortune cookie factory, for example. The structure of this work, it's broken into a lot of different pieces. The main thing is he's going to discuss nature, obviously, and what exactly that means. The structure here is he has the introduction in the first chapter, Nature, and then he goes into the uses of nature: commodity, beauty, language, and discipline. And these are the things that we sort of gather from nature. And then he sort of wraps it up by talking about idealism, which is sort of deals with the question of whether, the material world is actually real, spirit and the relationship to God, and also prospects or ideas of improvements or possibilities for the future. And that this is the basic layout of this piece of work. So as we go through this, we're just pretty much just going to look for great quotes and ideas that Emerson brings up, and then sort of do our best to unpack these grand ideas, because he's definitely not shy from putting out giant philosophical concepts and then sort of just expecting us to work our way through. A big thing with Emerson is just sort of taking your time and allowing yourself to bask in his genius, because he definitely is a brilliant individual, and just via going through nature, it will become blatantly obvious to us, just how many thoughts he had, and not just how many thoughts he had, but how exactly those thoughts are going to be beneficial to us. So, he opens up nature with a section simply called Introduction, in which he posits, he says, undoubtedly we have no questions to ask which are unanswerable, which is quite the assertion to make right out of the gate. Basically saying that any issue in the world is something that we can have an answer to. Many people would put this sort of just in terms of science, but he takes it a little bit further, and he says, every man's condition is a solution in hieroglyphic to those inquiries he would put. He acts at his life before he apprehends it as truth. So in this way, he's not just saying that we can answer all these questions relatively simplistically, but that living our lives in and of itself that our life is the answer to any questions we can put. So you can see already he's coming out throwing fastballs. The next thing that he needs to do after that is define his terms. What is nature? Usually, we usually consider nature in this sort of small sense. What Emerson refers to as the common usage. It's the idea of nature is something that's out there. Nature is trees. Nature is animals. Nature is the part of the world that is not denigrated by human activity and human intervention. That this is something that's separate from us, something that's out there in the world and doesn't include human interaction. That's sort of what you can consider lowercase n nature, that idea of something separate. So there's that idea of nature, which is a valid definition. Also important is the idea of capital N nature, this idea of nature as something grand, something larger, something bigger, and that this concept of nature is something that includes humanity and that literally, could equate to the idea of the absolute or the idea of, God and inclusiveness with the universe, that the universe and existence itself, that is fundamentally nature. So that's a much larger definition of nature. And I think it's interesting to go as you walk your way through this essay to actually sort of consider both of these definitions. Nature as something that's outside of us, but then nature also as something that in all ways includes us.